Here's the math nobody runs when they're filling their storage room with canned goods and sealed buckets of rice. A year's worth of food for one person weighs roughly 800 pounds. It takes up significant space, costs significant money, and requires significant security to protect. And when it's gone, when the last can is opened and the last bucket is empty, the person who built their entire survival strategy around what they stored is starting from zero in a world that has been collapsing for a year and has gotten substantially more dangerous than it was on day one. The people who actually survive long-term collapses are not the people who had the most going in. History is clear on this. The survivors are the people who could make things, who could take the raw materials that existed in their environment and produce outputs that other people needed badly enough to trade for, protect in exchange for, and organize around. Production capacity is not a supplement to survival strategy. It is the survival strategy once the stored goods run out, and they always run out. Here are the 7 things you need to be able to make from nothing after a collapse. Not skills to learn eventually, not items to stockpile. The actual production capabilities that generate ongoing survival value in a resource-depleted environment, and that almost nobody is developing right now because developing them is slower and less satisfying than buying another. Case of freeze-dried meals. 1. Drinkable water from any available source. This is on the list not because people don't know water purification exists, but because there's an enormous difference between knowing it exists and being able to execute it reliably with zero commercial inputs in field conditions. Most people's water purification plan depends on something they bought: a filter with a finite service life, chemical tablets that run out, a gravity system that requires replacement cartridges. All of these are bridges to the moment the commercial inputs are exhausted. After that moment, the person who doesn't know how to purify water with locally sourced materials is in trouble regardless of how much they spent on gear. The production capability here is a 3-layer system built from environmental materials. The first layer is a sediment filter constructed from layered sand, fine gravel, and crushed charcoal packed in a container with drainage holes at the base. These materials exist in virtually every environment on Earth, and this configuration removes particulates and reduces some chemical contamination. The second layer is heat treatment, a sustained rolling boil of at least 1 minute, which destroys bacteria, viruses, and protozoan parasites with a reliability that no improvised filter can match alone. The third layer is clean storage, a sealed container that prevents recontamination after treatment, because the most thoroughly purified water in the world becomes dangerous the moment it's poured into a contaminated vessel. The person who can construct this system from found materials can produce safe water indefinitely. The person whose water purification capability is a filter approaching its capacity limit has a countdown running that they may not be tracking. 2. Preserved food from raw ingredients. Not storing food, making food last. There is a difference between having food and knowing how to prevent food from becoming inedible. In a collapsed environment, the food available is often raw harvested, trapped, foraged, or traded. And the gap between raw food and food that lasts more than 3 days without refrigeration is the gap between eating continuously and eating in unreliable bursts interspersed with dangerous hunger. The production capabilities that close this gap have been standard human knowledge for most of history and have been almost entirely outsourced to industrial infrastructure in the last century. Smoking, which combines heat, low humidity, and antimicrobial compounds from wood combustion to extend meat shelf life from days to months. Salt curing, which draws moisture from tissue through osmotic pressure, creating an environment where bacterial growth slows to near zero. Fermentation, which uses controlled bacterial processes to produce an acidic environment that prevents competing microbial growth, the mechanism behind every preserved vegetable product that was standard subsistence food for centuries. Rendering fat from animal tissue, which provides a calorie-dense, long stable cooking medium and a food preservation agent. Dehydration over low heat, which removes the water that most spoilage organisms require to function. None of these techniques require purchased materials. All of them require knowledge and practice. The person who has practiced them on raw ingredients before they needed to is the person whose food supply extends beyond the harvest or hunt by weeks and months. The person who hasn't practiced them is throwing away food in an environment where throwing away food is a form of slow-motion death. 3. Effective medicine from available plants. The caveat first. This is not a claim that herbal medicine replaces pharmaceutical medicine. For serious infections, for traumatic injuries, for conditions requiring surgical intervention, the absence of modern medicine is the absence of modern medicine, and plants cannot compensate for that absence. What plants can do is manage the far more common medical situations that aren't serious infections or traumatic injuries. The persistent headache that erodes cognitive function, the digestive disruption that causes dehydration, the inflammatory response to injury that limits mobility, the skin infection caught early enough that an antimicrobial plant preparation can address it before it becomes systemic. These conditions, aggregated across a survival group over months, represent an enormous enormous burden on collective function, and many of them can be meaningfully addressed with plant-based preparations that grow in most temperate environments. The production capability requires three things: accurate identification of the plants in your specific region, not general knowledge, specific regional knowledge, with visual identification practiced before you need it. Knowledge of preparation methods, because active compounds often require water extraction, oil infusion, or alcohol extraction to be bioavailable, and realistic understanding of what these preparations do and don't do, because the danger isn't that they don't work, it's that people apply them to conditions they cannot address and delay recognizing that something more serious is happening. Willow bark for fever and pain, plantain leaf as a topical antimicrobial for surface wounds, yarrow for blood clotting support, pine needle for vitamin C. These are starting points, not a complete pharmacopoeia. The production capability begins with knowing what grows within a mile of where you are and what it does. 4. Light without electricity. This sounds trivial until you've navigated a building at 3 a.m. with threats potentially inside it and nothing but your hands in front of you because your flashlight battery finally gave out and nobody thought to develop a non-battery light source. Light production from locally available materials is a capability most people have never considered because light has been continuous, automatic, and essentially free their entire lives. When it stops being those things, the operational implications are significant. Security operations after dark require light for threat identification. Medical treatment requires light for wound assessment. Watch rotation requires light that doesn't compromise position security. The production capability centers on animal fat oil lamps, the primary light source for most of human civilization for most of human history. Rendered animal fat poured into a small container with a wick made from twisted plant fiber produces a flame that burns for hours. Per small quantity of fuel, generates minimal smoke, and can be shielded or directed in ways an open flame cannot. Beeswax candles produce a cleaner and more consistent flame. Pine resin torches provide higher intensity light for shorter durations from a material available in any conifer-dominant environment. The key is practicing the production before you need the product. Rendering fat, constructing wicks, building lamp containers from available materials. These have a learning curve. You do not want to be climbing in the dark during a situation where light is urgently needed. 5. Functional tools from salvaged metal. Every tool has a service life. Blades dull, handles break, metal fatigues under repeated stress. In a prolonged collapse, the tools that existed before are being consumed by a population that can no longer manufacture replacements through industrial means. The person who can maintain existing tools and produce functional new ones from salvaged metal becomes, over time, one of the most valuable people in any community because every other production capability on this list depends on having functional tools to execute it. Basic blacksmithing. The production of functional metal implements from salvaged steel using heat, hammer, and anvil was the foundational productive technology of human civilization for several thousand years. It does not require specialized equipment to begin. A fire hot enough to bring steel to workable temperature can be produced with a forced air bellows made from leather and wood. An anvil can be a large piece of salvaged steel of sufficient mass, a railroad spike, a section of I-beam, a truck axle, mounted firmly enough to absorb hammer blows. The tools produced don't need to be refined. They need to be functional. A blade that holds an edge, a hook that holds a load, a hinge that allows movement. These are achievable from basic forging operations that require weeks of practice to reach competence, not years. The person who develops this capability is the person who keeps every other productive capability in the group functional by maintaining the tools those capabilities depend on. 6. Rope and cordage from plant fiber. Every piece of cordage you own was manufactured, packaged, shipped, and purchased through a supply chain that no longer exists in a collapse. When it breaks or runs out, the question of what replaces it is not theoretical, it's operational. And the answer, for most of human history, was plant fiber processed by hand. Inner bark from dead wood, specifically basswood, cedar, and stinging nettle, are the most reliably productive species, is harvested, dried, separated into fibers, and twisted using a 2-ply reverse wrap technique that converts loose fiber into rope with tensile strength proportional to fiber quality and twist consistency. The production capability matters because cordage is the connective material of virtually every other production activity. It lashes shelter components together. It suspends food caches from branches. It builds snare traps. It creates early warning systems. It ties loads for transport. The technique is not difficult. It is slow and requires practice to produce consistent quality. The group that can produce new cordage continuously from local plant material never runs out. The group that cannot is counting their remaining supply every time they cut a piece. 7. Fermented alcohol. This is on the list for reasons that have nothing to do with recreation and everything to do with two production applications that make alcohol one of the most valuable outputs in a prolonged collapse. The first application is wound disinfection. Alcohol at sufficient concentration, approximately 60% or above, is an effective effective broad-spectrum antimicrobial for external use. In an environment without commercial antiseptics, the ability to produce alcohol for wound care is the ability to prevent surface infections from becoming systemic ones. That difference, in month 6 of a collapse, is often the difference between a healed wound and sepsis. The second application is trade value. Alcohol in a prolonged collapse has the properties of ideal currency, universally desired, stable demand, producible continuously from renewable inputs, non-perishable at drinking concentration, and divisible into units of any size. The person who produces consistent quality fermented spirits has a trade good that maintains value across every stage of a collapse, because human beings reliably want alcohol in exactly the conditions that make it hardest to obtain. Basic fermentation requires 3 inputs available in almost any environment: a fermentable sugar source, water, and wild yeast, which exists on the skin of virtually every fruit and grain, and in most open-air environments. The production process is the management of conditions that favor alcohol-producing yeast, temperature in the range of 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, exclusion of oxygen after initial fermentation begins, and prevention of contamination by competing microorganisms. Learnable without specialized equipment, worth practicing before the need is immediate. Here is the honest frame for all 7. Stockpiling is a preparation strategy for the beginning of a collapse. Production capability is a survival strategy for the middle and the end of one. They are not alternatives. They are sequential. One covers the period before production capacity is needed. The other covers the period after stored supplies are gone. The problem is that almost all preparation energy goes into the first strategy and almost none into the second. People fill rooms with supplies and call themselves prepared, which they are, for the first 90 days. What happens on day 91 is not addressed by anything in that room. The production capabilities on this list don't require significant financial investment. They require time and practice before the collapse makes practice impossible. An afternoon learning to build a sediment filter, a weekend learning to smoke meat, a month of occasional practice with plant fiber cordage. Basic fermentation started and managed through a full cycle. These are not exotic activities. They are the foundational productive skills of every human civilization that existed before industrial infrastructure made them unnecessary. The infrastructure removed the need for the skills. The collapse removes the infrastructure. At that point, the need returns, and the question is whether you develop them during the window when developing them was easy, or whether you're learning them during the window when failing to execute correctly costs you something you can't get back. The supplies run out. They always run out.